Hello, everybody. All right, welcome to. So today is Wednesday, June the 11th, 2025. That means, of course, for this week, that's Hump Day. Hopefully everybody's has had a happy and safe week thus far. I know to my fellow Southern Californians, particularly in parts of downtown LA and stuff, maybe not so, um, but hopefully everybody's having a good week overall. So with that all being said, of course, if you guys haven't done so already, if you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream, see if we can get some more friendly people in here to engage, that'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions, and I will try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. So, anyway, as always, we're going to give people a chance to come in before we get started. So I was watching, of course, the last of the February 1938 cartoons I was going to watch for now, including what apparently was Mae Quetzal's final gig as Betty Boop in February 1938. Her last Betty Boop cartoon. As of course, later in 38, Fleischer would move down to Florida, while of course Mae Quetzal stayed behind so she could start a family. Now, when Famous Studios bought out Fleischer and then came back to New York, of course, Mae Quetzal back in 1942, Mae Quetzal would of course rejoin the Popeye cast and be Olive's voice for the next 35 years or so until the all new Popeye comedy show in 1978, where Marilyn Schaefer had basically replaced her as the voice of Olive Oyl. But with that being said, let's see, we're almost at the 3-minute mark here. So once we hit that, then we'll talk about what's on tap for tonight. Let's see now. All right, so we are at the 3 minutes. So basically, I do have a couple of articles to go over tonight, both from MeTV Tunes, both Hanna-Barbara related articles. One of them focusing in on the Super Friends, the other kind of focusing on, I guess, the relationship between Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. A couple of nice little quickie articles, and then of course from there, of course, we have the Wrestling Rabbit. We'll look back to last night's NXT, look ahead to tonight's AEW. Of course, WWE, of course, still coming off of the Worlds Collide and Money in the Bank pay-per-views. Of course, some interesting news coming out of NXT last night, as well as some of the matches that were played out. Let's see. And of course, also we have kind of a quote-unquote debut, as it were. And then, of course, after the wrestling wrap-up, we'll of course take a look back at this day in each history. So, with all that being said, why don't we go ahead and get started then? Let's get to our first article, of course. Should take us a few minutes here. First article we're going to look at here, of course, is the MeTV Tunes Guide to the Heroes of Super Friends. I need a hero, but which one? Article posted June 11th, 2025 by MeTV Toon staff. So you have all the different incarnations of course, the Super Friends and the supporting cast members of each. So let's see what they have to say here. So, Robin and Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and even Aquaman too. But do you recall the rest of the guest heroes on Super Friends? They're heroes who heard calls for help and served in the Hall of Justice, defending good and defeating evil. Let's take a look at the great heroes from Super Friends. Now, of course, as many of you might remember, Super Friends was a cartoon. It was a cartoon series that started in 1973. Produced by Hanna-Barbara. It was part of ABC Saturday Morning from like 1973 all the way to 1985. Went through a number of different incarnations. An hour-long incarnation starting in 73. And then you had, of course, the all-new Super Friends hour in 1976. That went from 76 to, 76, 77. And then you had Challenge of the Super Friends in 1978. World's Greatest Super Friends 1979. And then Super Friends 1980. With, of course, the quote-unquote lost episodes in 83. And then I believe in 84, you had the legendary Superpowers team, and then Galactic Guardians in 85. So there's your brief kind of rundown of the quick history of it. So let's now get into the the profiles of each of the different set of heroes. So the first set of guest heroes, the first set of apprentices, Super Friends apprentices, of course, were Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog. Of course, Wendy voiced by Sherry Alberoni. Marvin and Wonder Dog, of course, Marvin voiced by, and Wonder Dog's vocal effects done by Frank Welker. So, Wendy and Marvin were the first pair of junior Super Friends from the first season of Super Friends. A little redundant there, but because they had no, in parentheses, or in Marvin's case, very limited, unparenthesed, superpowers, they were mentored by Batman and Robin in skills like investigation, agility, and disguises. Yeah, it's like they were just basically Wendy and Marvin were basically were just normal teenagers. They had no superpowers. So, much like Batman and Robin, they had to be trained, they had to be trained in, obvious various forms of like criminology, investigation, agility, obviously agility, the ability to, move your body in ways where you can properly defend yourself. And of course, the whole idea of Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog was to kind of, remember, Super Friends was a Saturday morning cartoon. So the show itself was, of course, directed towards kids, notably those between, let's say, 5 and 10 years of age. So you needed characters there that could actually relate to the Super Friends, give maybe the younger, young person's perspective, right? And they often did. So, and that was usually the case with no matter if they were like younger teenagers like Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog, or some of the older ones that we'll see in later series, the ones who actually did have superpowers, and we'll see. If I had to guess, Wendy and Marvin were probably maybe around 13, 14, 15, somewhere in that range, if I had to guess. So again, your typical, you're just normal teenagers at the time. So now number 2, Apache Chief. Now, I know there are some people out there who will find Hanna-Barbara's attempt to diversify the Super Friends. They might find it a bit insulting today, but at the time, this is the characters of and Apache Chief, Samurai, Black Vulcan, El Dorado, Rima. These characters were meant to try to make the Super Friends a little bit more racially diversified at the time, and was considered acceptable at the time. Maybe by today's standards and by today's sensibilities, some people might find that they may have been a little too stereotyped. But I think they did still serve their purpose and they did have some they did have some considerable plot lines in certain storylines. Apache Chief, who of course, and one last little note here, who was voiced by Michael Rye. Michael Rye was the guy who provided the voice of Apache Chief here. Apache Chief joined the Justice League in 1977's the all-new Super Friends Hour. He first appeared in the second episode segment, The Antidote, where he assists Wonder Woman in finding a giant cobra. His superpowers include being able to change his size at will, and throughout the show, he develops the skill to increase his growing to an unlimited size, even becoming as large as 1/5 of the Earth. Yeah, I remember. And how he would activate it is with the Native American word in neck chalk. In neck chalk. And he would, initially he would grow to like 50 feet in height, but then there was one episode where he kept growing to where he had to face somebody. He had to face somebody who was actually a giant who would go around the solar system, basically using planets as marbles, basically. So, and of course, in Challenge of the Super Friends, they kind of readjusted DC continuity to where Giganta would actually become his arch enemy. Now, for those of you who for a lot of the comic book people, I'm sure you all remember that Giganta originally debuted in comics as one of Wonder Woman's enemies, one of Wonder Woman's rogues. She was originally a gorilla who was changed into a human, and of course had superhuman strength and cunning and all that. Of course, she'd also wear the of course. Even in the comics, Giganta would wear the like leopard skin, outfit, with the top and the shorts or what have you, and be barefoot. And then she'd have the things on, the kind of anklets on her feet and all that, In Super Friends, what they did with Giganta, of course. Giganta, when Apache Chief was first given the magic powder that initially gave him his powers to grow big, she lassoed it and shook it on herself. So, so there's some little interesting tidbits for you guys there. Black Vulcan, of course, voiced by the late great Buster Jones, who of course was known throughout the 70s and 80s for doing a number of different voices in cartoons. Of course, Black Vulcan in Super Friends, the Super Friends franchise. He was Doc in I believe Doc and Zap in G.I. Joe. He was Blaster in Transformers. You could hear his voice pretty distinctly in a few cartoons. But Great Lightning. Black Vulcan also joined the Justice League in 1977, the all-new Super Friends Hour. He was created to replace the pre-existing comic book character Black Lightning, who could not be in the show due to disputes with the character's creator. His first appearance was in the first episode in the segment The Whirlpool, where he and Aquaman escape a whirlpool. His superpowers include the ability to shoot electric bolts from his hands, super fast flight, and the ability to transform himself into electricity, allowing him to travel at light speed. Yeah, it's kind of funny. His ability to fly and his ability to turn into a lightning bolt were kind of intertwined. It's basically how he flew. He became a lightning bolt and just shot over the skies as a lightning bolt. So, and yes, there was a pre-existing character at the time who actually debuted 2 years in the comics, I believe, before Black Vulcan, they called Black Lightning. So, who didn't, of course, have Black Lightning had powers that were more akin to the later hero Static Shock than to the Black Vulcan. In fact, for those of you who may have watched, Static Shock in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I remember the first episode where when he was trying to figure out a costume for himself, he actually did have a Black Vulcan costume, and Richie goes, "Yeah, you look more like a battery commercial." So, all right. The Wonder Twins and Gleek. So here's another pair of junior Super Friends. This is the next pair, probably an older pair. I'll get a little bit. So this older pair, I mean, from the looks of it, you could argue they're probably somewhere in the maybe 16 to 18, maybe 17 to 19 range. There's anywhere from 16 to 19. They're obviously older than. Now, granted, they're also from Exor, so their aging may be different there than as on Earth. But and of course, the Wonder Twins and Gleek. So Zan and Gleek were voiced by Michael Bell, longtime voice actor. Also did, of course, the voices of Duke and G.I. Joe, Prowl and Sideswipe and Transformers, who is also a guest star on the debut episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Escape to Farpoint, and Jaina, of course, was voiced by Louise Liberty Williams. So, also joining the team in the all-new Super Friends Hour, the Wonder Twins are the new generation of junior Super Friends. Zan and Jaina are alien twins who possess the power to transform when they punch their fists together and say Wonder Twin powers activate. Jaina can transform into any animal, and Zan can transform into any form of water. They first appeared in Joyride, and of course, in the all-new Super Friends Hour, there was always a segment dedicated specifically to them, handling maybe more minor, as compared to what the older, more mature, like Joyride was the case where a guy who was on the verge of getting his pilot's license decided to take a plane for a joyride, and the plane that they took had some mechanical issues. They had to rescue him. Situations where you had an episode of kind of the idea of taking rides from the train, even as teenagers, right? Or simpler stuff that was more, simpler things, or I wouldn't say simpler, but things where usually dealing more with more minor emergencies as compared to things that were cosmic or catastrophic. So they were apprentice Super Friends. They usually were there in support roles. You know, oftentimes, of course, oftentimes being when they'd either have monitor duty at the Hall of Justice would be or would usually, if they were to go out on missions with the quote unquote adult Super Friends, um, they'd usually be paired up, usually with Batman, Robin, or Wonder Woman to go do things. So, anyways, Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Now here's a pair from the from the comics, based on, of course, the Silver Age comics, the Earth One versions of Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Here, the husband and wife duo have the power of hawks and enhanced sight, enhanced hearing, super strength, um, flight, and hawk instincts, or a strong gut feeling. Now, the Hawkman and Hawkgirl here were based more on the Earth 1 versions, but they also had elements of Earth 2. Like, for example, they would use Earth 2's names, Carter and Shiera Hall, instead of Katar Hall and obviously, because this was, of course, a cartoon, they didn't really talk too much about their Thanagarian heritage. That was, you saw that more in of course, Justice League Unlimited years later. So you had elements of both Earth 2 and Earth 1. Let's see. Hawkman, I believe, was voiced by Jack Angel. Somebody who lent his voice to a number of characters on Super Friends. We'll talk about some more of them in a bit. As well, of course, as Ultra Magnus and Ultra Magnus and Ultra Magnus in Transformers Generation 1. He actually did Cyclonus in the last portions of he basically took over Cyclonus' voice after the passing of Roger C. Carmel in Transformers. He was Wetsuit in G.I. Joe. I think he lent his voice to Nick Fury. He was a second voice for Nick Fury in Spider-Man, the animated series. So, and Hawk Girl was actually voiced by, I believe, Shannon Farnan actually did her voice, and Shannon Farnan, of course, was also the voice of Wonder Woman, through the first couple of series of Super Friends, up through I think it was actually all the way up through Super Friends 1980, I believe, and then Connie Conwell, I think, took over for Wonder Woman in the Legendary Superpowers team, I believe. Anyways, Rima the Jungle Girl. Now here's another kind of diversified character. Somebody who's believed to be of South American descent, from the Amazon. She also was voiced by Shannon Farnan. Rima was adapted from the lead character of the 1904 novel Green Mansions, a romance of the tropical forest by W.H. Hudson. In Super Friends, she has superpowers of animal senses and empathy, animal communications, agility, and commanding animals. She is also an expert tracker and zoologist. Of course, some of her powers. Rima the Jungle Girl is to the jungle what Aquaman was to the sea, right? Basically, but basically of South American descent, basically. So The Atom, of course, this is based now. For the most part, most of the characters from the comics that appeared in Super Friends, in case you haven't figured it out already, um, most of the characters that came from the comics and Super Friends are based on the Earth One versions or the Silver Age version. So it was Ray Palmer being portrayed here, obviously, as opposed to Al Pratt. So he's on Vulcan's shoulder. Um, while Apache Chief can grow to giant sizes, the Atom can only shrink smaller and smaller. But Atom has additional superpowers too, like subatomic super strength and flight. So yeah, he's you know and of course he also, granted, while not being focused as much here, he also had obviously some knowledge of physics, obviously. Um, the Atom in Super Friends was voiced by voice director Wally Burr, I believe. So, who of course is also the voice director for Transformers. So, Green Lantern, who of course who's voiced another guy was voiced by Michael Rye. The Green Lantern has no powers, but he was chosen by the Green Lantern Corps to wield the Green Lantern ring, which allows him to create objects, force field, energy blast, and even fly. So basically, like all Green Lanterns, he doesn't have any innate superpowers all of his own. All of his powers come from the ring, basically the ring and the lantern, right? Again, this is Hal Jordan, the Hal Jordan version from Earth One, as we previously stated, voiced by Michael Rye. He is a founding member of the Justice League, even though he does not appear in the Super Friends until 1978's Challenge of the Super Friends. Yeah, just like on Earth 2, Green Lantern was a founding member of both the Green Lantern of Earth 2 of Alan Scott was a founding member of the Justice Society of America. Green Lantern I believe what was considered a founding member of the Justice League. And of course, his arch enemy Sinestro, voiced by Vic Perrin, was also in Challenge of the Super Friends. So, Samurai. Here's another diversity addition to the Super Friends here. Samurai, of course, voiced by Jack Angel, one of I think like 3, maybe 4 characters in Super. Let's see. We already talked about Hawkman, Samurai, and we'll get to the other guy that he voiced in a bit here. Samurai, voiced by it's kind of funny too because even though they named him Samurai, you could argue that his powers were probably more in line with ninjas than really samurai, because samurais were swordsmen. But yet, if you ever noticed, he never carried a sword. He never used a sword. He could let's read. Samurai received his powers after being struck by magic lightning. His powers include invisibility, illusion casting, and transforming himself into flames and tornadoes. His first appearance was in Volcano, where he helped save aliens from an erupting volcano. Yes, and he could, and the thing about Samurai too is that, basically the idea was illusion casting, the ability to turn himself invisible and basically, could turn himself to forms of wind and flame. And I'm sure somewhere in there, maybe even water and earth too. But I think they just didn't want to go too crazy. But I think the wind powers are probably his most diverse, where he could turn the lower half of his body into a tornado to where he could fly. He would, create little air balls to throw at people, or shoot tornadoes out of his hands. But his power, even though he's called a samurai is a Japanese swordsman. Okay. His powers were probably more akin to a ninja, but since a ninja is an assassin, especially on a kid's show, calling a superhero ninja is probably, especially back in 1978, and with all the parent councils and all that at the time, they couldn't call a hero a ninja. They couldn't have him title. They couldn't call him ninja, so they call him samurai, because samurais at least, have a more honorable tradition, as it were. The Flash. Okay, so there's a third character who is voiced by Jack Angel. Let's get up to speed. Flash has been a guest hero since the first season of Super Friends, and became a full-time member of the team in Challenge of the Super Friends. His main superpower is superhuman speed. Of course, again, this is the Earth 1 version that they're portraying here. Barry Allen, super speed and basically everything that comes with that. In Challenge of Super Friends, of course, his arch enemy Captain Cold was also used. Let's see, Dick Ryle, I believe, was the guy who voiced Captain Cold in Challenge of the Super Friends. Let's see what. Oh yeah, I'd better hurry along here a little bit. Let's see, 10. And yeah, Plastic Man. Plastic Man originally was, of course, a Quality Comics character, debuting, I believe it was in Police Comics #1. When, of course, WWE bought up Quality, they bought up, they got the rights to Plastic Man. I don't remember off the top of my head who voiced him here. Actually, I think it might have been the guy who voiced Aquaman, who might have voiced him. William Alden, I believe. Anyways, Plastic Man has been a guest hero since the beginning of Super Friends. A comedically inclined hero, he possesses the ability to stretch to superhuman lengths and change his size and shape, like plastic. He also stars in his own spin-off, Plastic Man, which you can also watch on MeTV Toons. And you have Green Arrow, who was also voiced by, I think he was also voiced by the guy who voiced Norm Alden. That's who it is, Norm Alden. Norm Alden voiced, I think, both Plastic Man and Green Arrow. Green Arrow, inspired by Robin Hood, Green Arrow hails from Seattle and has spent his life developing his skills in archery, acrobatics, martial arts, sword fighting, and strength. His crime fighting comes from a lifetime of training, and he is the greatest archer out of all the Super Friends. Yeah. And of course, this is the Earth 1 version. Well, Green Arrow is another character who basically Like Green Arrow and Aquaman also had parallels on both Earth 1 and Earth 2. It's just that in Aquaman's case, his Earth 2 version was not very memorable. He did eventually join the All-Star Squadron, and the Earth 2 version of Green Arrow was actually more linked to no, they were in leading comic. The Seven Soldiers of Victory. That's right. El Dorado. He has another like diversity character they used in there. Voiced by Fernando Escandando, I believe. While El Dorado does not have an official backstory, El Dorado, of course, is, I believe, translates from Spanish as the Golden One, I believe. He is an expert on pre-Columbian history and the ruins of ancient Latin America. El Dorado's powers come from his telepathic abilities. He can shoot eye lasers, teleport, read minds, alter his size and mass, and cast illusions with his eyes. He can also send mental images to other Super Friends. And of course, his cape there gives him the power to teleport as well. That's the thing they didn't mention here. Firestorm, who made his debut in the comics, I believe, in the late, I think 1978, I believe. Firestorm, the Nuclear Man. And of course, in his appearances in Super Friends, he was, again, another junior Super Friends, voiced by Mark Taylor. Firestorm joined the Super Friends in 1984 Super Friends, the legendary superpowers team show. Firestorm has an interesting backstory. Teenager Ronnie Raymond and physicist Martin Stein were in an accident together, giving them the ability to fuse together into Firestorm, the Nuclear Man. Their powers include super strength, supervision, flight, and energy projection in the form of nuclear blast. Now, he could basically pass through inanimate objects. He could change, like, he didn't necessarily have superhuman. He could fly, but he didn't really display anything like supervision or super strength. That's kind of wrong there. His powers dealt more with how he dealt with matter. He could pass through matter, phase through it, as it were. He could alter inanimate objects. His powers could not work on organic materials. Could not work on anything basically living. So he basically had a little bit differently from the Atom. He had kind of he had control over basically like nuclear, the elements, Cyborg. And the Cyborg here was, of course, voiced by Ernie Hudson. One of the last heroes to join the Super Friends, Cyborg, met the Super Friends when he captured Lex Luthor in the Superpowers Team Galactic Guardian. He was originally a decathlon athlete till he was in a terrible accident. The accident forced his robotics genius father to save his son's life by transforming him into a super cyborg. Joining the team around the same time, Cyborg and Firestorm became a new era of junior Super Friends. So when Firestorm debuted on the previous seasons, so he came in Galactic Guardians, which is 1985, so a year after actually Firestorm. Firestorm did have an episode where he was kind of paired up with Robin and the Wonder Twins as a junior Super Friends. But anyways, watch Super Friends on MeTV Tunes weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern to Central, noon Pacific, and 2 a.m. Eastern, 1 a.m. Central, 11 p.m. 11 p.m. Pacific. Saturdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central, 10 Pacific. So the weekdays and weeknights, weeknight episodes, the weekday episodes there are 1 hour each, and then the Saturday episodes a 2 hour block. So let's see now. Yeah, I think we got enough time to get through the other one. Let's see. Hi, but hey, Fitzozo, thanks for dropping in. Let's see. What would happen if Firestorm fought Captain Atom? Yeah, I think Captain Atom would probably ultimately beat him. Because Captain Atom basically is basically all energy. You know, so he literally is. So I think Captain Atom, because Firestorm still, even with even his form, is still basically mortal flesh. So as Ronnie Raymond and Martin Stein, they would still be. But if Firestorm, and I think basically, I think Captain Atom would most likely overpower him, from what I would understand. But anyways, let's move on to the second and last article we're going to do tonight here, which is another Hanna-Barbera. And this one will probably be a little bit quicker. I was looking at it earlier. It was actually a pretty short article. Bill Hanna said Joe Barbera was most like this character. Here's a hint. He's in the picture. Article published today by MeTV Toon staff. So I'm guessing he's basically going to say that Joe Barbera is either Huckleberry Hound, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, or Fred Flintstone. Let's see what he says here. So as the creator of classic cartoons like Huckleberry Hound, Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, and Tom and Jerry, Bill Hanna was often asked by fans to choose his favorite character out of all of the Hanna-Barbera creations. He answered rather coyly in his book, quote, "Quite predictably, I think our mutual and heartfelt response is acknowledging our first love, Tom and Jerry," unquote. Ah, the first characters they created together. How nice. But Hanna then conveyed that Joe Barbera had a new favorite character, Yogi Bear. In Hanna's memoir, A Cast of Friends, he wrote, "A character, quote, the character nearest his heart has always been an Epicurean bear, with a pork pie that hat named Yogi," unquote. Hanna recalled, quote, "In many respects, I think Joe and Yogi Bear are kindred spirits. They share an endearing kind of optimistic and urbane love for the good life, a love that through my long association with Yogi and longer association with Joe, I've discovered appears to be for both a kind of perennial fountain of youth," unquote. Perhaps this is why it was so easy for Yogi Bear to eclipse Huckleberry Hound's rising star. Being the favorite character of the co-creator must be its perks, But when it came to describing his own favorite character, Hanna remained mysterious, saying, quote, "My special pal among our later television cast is a blustery guy who is waiting in the wings of this book," unquote. This would be a fine answer, but Hanna did not specify the exact favorite character later in the book. Now we have a mystery. Who is the blustery guy? Blustery is typically used to describe windy weather conditions who apply to a person. It means arrogant, pompous, and full of bravado and empty threats. Sounds like any cartoon characters, you know. We at MeTV Tunes think this must be Fred Flintstone, but tell us in the comments on social media who you think the blustery guy. Well, I could see it. I could see it being Fred, because blustery. Another adjective for somebody who's called blustery could be a guy who's a blowhard. And I don't think there was no bigger blowhard among the Hanna-Barbera characters than Fred Flintstone. And of course, fans love him for that. Fans love Fred for being a blowhard. So, watch House of Hanna-Barbera on MeTV Tunes. Weekdays at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 Central, 8 Pacific, and Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central, and 10 a.m. Pacific. All right, then. So that's all we got for the articles for you guys tonight. So now we're gonna move on to the wrestling wrap up, and we're gonna try to get it done pretty quickly as possible here. And I'm kind of running a little long on what I was trying to go for here. So on last night's WWE NXT, we saw on the show, of course, we did see the woman known formally to everybody as AEW's Mariah May being repackaged under the name Blake Monroe. So she's still calling herself the Glamour, of course, but now it's the Glamour Blake Monroe. So she made her official debut on, well, yeah, she made more of a vignette debut on last night's show under her new character. She debuted under her new name, basically. Also on the show opened up with a NXT North American title match in which Ethan Page retained over Shawn Legacy. And then in the second match, the duo from the culling duo of Sean Spears and Nico Vance defeated Josh Briggs and Yoshiki Inamura. In just over 4 minutes, Lash Legend defeated Ren Sinclair. And then in a NXT Women's title match, JC Jane defended against Lainey Reed. And after the match, Ava came out to announce that they were going to have a bit of a tournament to determine the next JC Jane's next challenger for the NXT Women's title. 8 women will compete in 4 singles matches next week on the 17th, and the following week on the 24th. The 4 winners of those matches will face off in a 4-way match to determine who will face JC Jane for the NXT Women's title at the upcoming all-women's pay-per-view Evolution. I know I don't remember the exact matchups, but I know Jordan Grace will be involved in that. Kalani Jordan, Jada Parker, Zarya, Izzy Dane, So Lola Vice. So a number of NXT star, 8 women will be competing to become the next challenger to JCJ at Evolution. Wesley led the duo that he had under his wings, now being repackaged as the High Rise of Tyson DuPont and Tyreek Igwe, defeated the team of Luca Crucifino and Tony D'Angelo. As one of Tony D'Angelo's former family members came down and basically got his attention, allowing the High Rise to get their debut as the High Rise, and then the main event, so Oba Femi defend the NXT title against recent new signee and LFG champion Jasper Troy. And only his second match on NXT. So there we go with that one. So that was it for the WE stuff. Now looking ahead to tonight's NXT AEW rather. There's summer blockbuster event on Dynamite coming from the Theater of the Clouds at Moda Center in Portland, Oregon, with Excalibur, Ian Riccaboni, and Taz on commentary, and Mercedes Moné providing some commentary as well. Swerve Strickland is set to take on Will Ospreay, the match set up last week, as Will Ospreay looks to try to slap some sense into Swerve, trying to get him to get on page with him, and Hangman had made no pun intended, of course. Mystico, CMLL star Mystico is set to take on Blake Christian. In a women's tag team match that resulted after Megan Bayne and Penelope Ford's attack on Anna Jay last week. Last week, of course, saw the return of Ty Mello. As she and Anna Jay will be taking on Megan Bayne and Penelope Ford in a Ty Jay will be taking on Bayne and Ford in a women's tag team match. In a non-title match, AEW Women's World Champion Toni Storm takes on Julia Hart, former TBS champion, with I believe Mercedes Moné will be in the booth for that. Thekla in her second match with AEW will be taking on Queen Aminata. Anthony Bowens looks to get back on track after his recent loss to Kazuchika Okada, looking to try to get a shot at the Continental title. Will be taking on Don Callis family's Kyle Fletcher. And then the team of Jet Speed of Mike Bailey and Kevin Knight team up with CMLL's Mascara Dorado to take on the Hurt Syndicate of Shelton Benjamin, Bobby Lashley, and MJF, MVP in their corners. So that's all I got for you on the wrestling wrap-up. So now we're going to take a quick peek at, with today being, of course, June 11th, 2025. Let's go ahead and take a look back at this day in Nietzsche history. So, first off, I'd actually like to wish a happy 80th birthday to actress Adrienne Barbeau. Now, most people know Adrienne from her time on Maude as Maude's daughter, as B. Author's daughter on there. But in the world of animation, she's had some notable roles, including she was Catwoman in the DC animated universe. So basically, starting in, of course, Batman the Animated Series in 1992. Also having, I don't know if she had, throughout, she primarily worked the Batman, Batman the Animated Series, the new Batman Adventures. I don't remember her doing anything other than those shows in particular, but she also was Simone Lenoir in Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, and then Helga von Guggen in Totally Spies. So happy 80th birthday to actress Adrienne Barbeau, born on this date back in 1945. So now, moving ahead to the year 1985, 40 years ago today. On this date, 40 years ago today, the 10th issue of Katie Keene from Archie's Red Circle imprint went on sale on this date back in 1985. So this was I think the second book called. So this might be considered volume 2 of the Katie Keene series, but albeit this was on a specific imprint, the Red Circle imprint, number 10 here. It cost 65 cents and it was 32 pages. So 40 years ago today, the 10th issue of Archie's Red Circle imprint, Katie Keene book went on sale on this date back in 1985. And finally, on this date 10 years ago today, Virgil Riley Runnels Jr., better known to wrestling fans as Dusty Rhodes, passed away at the age of 69 on this date 10 years ago today. So 10 years ago today, Dusty Rhodes passed away at the age of 69. A 3-time NWA World Champion, a man who was, well known for his contributions to the business, was a very flamboyant character, booker, commentator, wrestler, among other things. Of course, his sons, Dustin and Cody, also had pretty successful careers as well. So that happened 10 years ago today. So that's all I got for you guys tonight. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. We'll be back with more Niche News tomorrow. Of course, I'll have Apex from Apex Comics joining me on Sunday. We look back to comics went on sale in May of 1940. I believe we'll be looking at books coming out from Standard that year on that day. So with that, I thank everybody for being here, and I hope to see everybody back here tomorrow. Bye.